The moment Steve Harvey heard those two words, the entire studio fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, but the heavy silence that comes when everyone realizes they're witnessing something that transcends entertainment. Maria Gonzalez, 14 years old with tears streaming down her face, had just given an answer that stopped America's most beloved game show host mid-sentence and changed everything anyone thought they knew about dreams, determination, and the unbreakable bond between a father and daughter. It had started as an ordinary Wednesday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The familiar blue and gold set gleamed under the television lights. The iconic buzzer system hummed with electronic readiness, and Steve Harvey adjusted his burgundy tie as makeup artists applied the finishing touches before taping. In his dressing room, he reviewed the family profiles with practiced efficiency, mentally preparing for another day of bringing joy and laughter to American households across the country. But 500 miles away in San Antonio, Texas, a very different kind of preparation had been taking place for the past 6 months. The Gonzalez family had been planning, saving, and hoping for this moment ever since they'd received the call that would change their lives. It wasn't just about the potential prize money, though the $20,000 could transform everything for a family already struggling to stay afloat. It was about something deeper, something that had been broken 18 months ago and desperately needed healing. Diego Gonzalez sat in his wheelchair in the hotel room, staring at his reflection in the mirror, with the mixture of determination and heartbreak that had become his daily companion. At 42, he had been a construction foreman, a man whose hands had built homes for dozens of families, whose strong back had supported his own family's dreams, whose powerful legs had carried him through life with confidence and purpose. Those legs, now motionless beneath a blanket, served as a constant reminder of the moment when everything changed. The accident had happened on a Tuesday morning in March, during what should have been a routine safety inspection. Diego had been working on the 40-story Riverwalk Tower project, the kind of prestigious construction job that promised steady income and professional recognition. He had been with Martinez Construction for 12 years, working his way up from general laborer to foreman through dedication and skill. The scaffolding inspection should have been routine, but the cable that supported the platform had been compromised by a defective weld. When the platform gave way beneath Diego's feet, he had exactly 3 seconds to realize that everything was about to change forever. The fall sent him plummeting 3 stories to the concrete below. He woke up 6 days later in the intensive care unit, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of hospital disinfectant and the constant beeping of machines. Carmen was asleep in a chair beside his bed, her face showing the exhaustion and fear that come from a week of uncertainty and prayer. The doctor who delivered the diagnosis was young, and he delivered the news with clinical detachment: complete spinal cord injury at the L2 vertebra, paralysis from the waist down, permanent, no chance of recovery. With current medical technology, Diego would never walk again. For 6 months after the accident, Diego had retreated into a darkness that no amount of physical therapy or family support could penetrate. He watched from his wheelchair as Carmen took on a second job in addition to her shifts at the diner, working 16-hour days to keep up with medical bills. He saw his 14-year-old daughter Maria transform from a carefree teenager into a young woman who cooked dinner, helped with household repairs, and handled adult responsibilities that no child should carry. But Maria Gonzalez saw her father differently than he saw himself. She remembered the Saturday mornings when he would take her to the track at the local high school, timing her laps with a stopwatch and cheering for personal records that only mattered because they mattered to her. She thought about the promises he had made about being part of her future, walking her down the aisle at her wedding, teaching his grandchildren to ride bicycles. Most of all, Maria remembered the promise Diego had made on her 13th birthday, just 2 months before the accident. "Mija," he had said, "when you graduate from high school, we're going to run a 5K together, father and daughter, crossing that finish line, hand in hand." She also remembered the conversation they had shared 1 week before the accident, when she had come home frustrated after trying out for the varsity cross-country team. She had finished dead last in the time trials, embarrassed and convinced she didn't have what it took to compete. "Mija," Diego had said, pulling her close, "listen to me very carefully. Running isn't about being faster than other people. It's about being stronger than you were yesterday." It's about refusing to quit when everything in your body is telling you to stop. And most of all, it's about understanding that the finish line is just the beginning of the next race. Now, 18 months later, Maria kept those words alive through her secret training routine. Every morning before dawn, she would slip out of the house and run the neighborhood streets, building the endurance that would make her father proud when the time came to keep his promise. The Family Feud opportunity had emerged from Carmen's growing desperation rather than optimism. She had seen the casting call announcement during her break at the hospital cafeteria, and something about Steve Harvey's warm smile had planted a seed of possibility. The $20,000 grand prize could cover months of Diego's ongoing medical expenses, maybe allow her to reduce her work schedule. But more than the money, Carmen hoped that the experience of competing together might remind Diego of the joy he used to find in life and the dreams they used to share. The audition process had been grueling for a family already stretched to their limits. Diego had resisted participating, convinced that his presence in a wheelchair would make them appear pitiful rather than entertaining. But Maria had refused to accept her father's resignation. "Papa," she had said, using the childhood name she rarely spoke anymore, "you taught me that running isn't about being faster than other people. It's about being stronger than you were yesterday. Yesterday we were a family falling apart because we forgot how to dream together. Today, we can choose to be a family that refuses to give up on each other." The conviction in her voice had finally broken through Diego's defenses. For the first time since the accident, he had agreed to take a risk, to reach towards something that might be possible. The audition waiting room had been filled with energetic, confident families who seemed to belong on television. The Gonzalez family sat quietly in their corner, Diego's wheelchair, creating both physical and psychological separation from the other contestants. But when their turn came for the group interview, something unexpected happened. The casting director asked each family member what winning $20,000 would mean to them. Carmen talked about paying medical bills and reducing her work schedule to spend more time at home. Diego spoke quietly about helping his family achieve financial stability. But when the microphone reached Maria, she looked directly at her father and said, "I want to use the money to help my dad remember that he's still the strongest man I know." The honesty in her voice, the maturity in her words, and the love shining in her eyes as she looked at Diego created a moment that transcended the typical casting process. Here was a 14-year-old girl who understood loss, who had watched her family struggle, but who refused to give up on the belief that love could overcome any obstacle. The producers knew immediately that the Gonzalez family had something special, something that would resonate with viewers across America. The call came 3 weeks later, just as Diego was preparing to attend yet another medical appointment that would likely result in more bills they couldn't afford and more confirmation of limitations he couldn't accept. Carmen answered the phone with her usual exhausted caution, expecting another collection agency or insurance company. Instead, she heard the excited voice of a Family Feud producer informing her that the Gonzalez family had been selected to compete on the show. The next 6 weeks of preparation had been the most hopeful time the family had experienced since the accident. They studied survey answers together at the kitchen table, with Diego's competitive spirit gradually emerging as he drilled Maria and Carmen on popular responses. They practiced buzzer timing using a makeshift setup that Diego had engineered from his wheelchair position, proving that his sharp mind and problem-solving abilities remained intact despite his physical limitations. Most importantly, they began to function as a team again. For 18 months, each family member had been struggling individually with their own version of grief and adaptation. Carmen grieved the loss of her partner's physical strength and worried constantly about their financial future. Diego grieved the loss of his identity as provider and protector while battling depression and phantom pain. Maria grieved the loss of her childhood and the dreams she thought they could no longer share. But preparing for Family Feud required them to communicate, to strategize, and to support each other in ways they hadn't managed since before the accident. Slowly, tentatively, they began to remember what they had been like as a family, when joy was still possible and dreams still felt achievable. Now, sitting in the hotel room in Atlanta, on the morning of their taping, Maria watched her father prepare for what he kept calling the performance of our lives. But she knew this wasn't about performing. This was about proving to her father that he was still the man she had always looked up to, still the person whose approval meant more than anything else in the world. The Family Feud studio buzzed with the controlled chaos of television production as the Gonzalez family was escorted to their green room. Camera operators checked angles, sound technicians tested microphone levels, and producers briefed the families on the basic rules and procedures. Steve Harvey reviewed his notes in his dressing room, his usual pre-show ritual of meditation and mental preparation, helping him shift into the mindset that had made him one of America's most beloved television personalities. When the families were introduced to the studio audience, the energy was electric. The opposing family, the Johnsons from Detroit, were experienced game show contestants who had competed on other programs and approached Family Feud with strategic precision and obvious confidence. They high-fived each other, waved enthusiastically to the audience, and exuded the kind of television-ready energy that made for great entertainment. The Gonzalez family's entrance was different. Diego rolled his wheelchair onto the set with quiet dignity, followed by Carmen, who walked with the cautious posture of someone carrying invisible weight, and Maria, who moved with the careful grace of a young person who had learned too early that life can change in an instant. They didn't have the natural showmanship of professional contestants, but there was something authentic about their presence that immediately caught Steve Harvey's attention. During the family introductions, Steve approached each contestant with his characteristic warmth and humor. He joked with Carmen about working at the diner, asking if she knew the secret to perfect hash browns. He complimented Diego on his obvious intelligence and asked about his background in construction, but when he reached Maria, something in her serious dark eyes gave him pause. "And this young lady right here," Steve said, crouching down slightly to be at Maria's eye level. "What do you like to do for fun, sweetheart?" Maria glanced quickly at her father before answering. "I like to run," she said simply. "I'm training for a race." "Oh, a runner? That's fantastic. What kind of race are you training for?" Again that quick glance toward Diego. "A 5K. I'm going to run it with my dad when I graduate from high school." Steve looked over at Diego, who was staring at his lap with an expression that mixed love and heartbreak in equal measure. Something about the interaction felt significant, though Steve couldn't immediately identify why. There was an undercurrent of emotion, a story beneath the surface that he sensed but couldn't quite access. "That's a beautiful goal," Steve said gently. "I bet your dad is proud of you for training so hard." "He taught me everything I know about not giving up," Maria replied, her voice strong despite the tears that were beginning to gather in her eyes. The game began with the familiar energy and excitement that made Family Feud America's favorite family game show. The first question was straightforward. Name something people do to stay healthy. The Johnsons won the face-off and chose to play, rattling off answers with practiced efficiency. Exercise, eat vegetables, get enough sleep, drink water, take vitamins. They dominated the round and built an early lead that put pressure on the Gonzalez family to perform. But during the second round, something shifted. The question was, name something that requires teamwork, and it was Diego's turn to answer. Steve positioned himself directly in front of Diego's wheelchair, maintaining eye contact and speaking with obvious respect. "All right, Diego, name something that requires teamwork." Diego looked up at Steve with an intensity that hadn't been there during the introductions. For the first time since the accident, he was in a position where his physical limitations were irrelevant, where his mind and heart were the only tools he needed to succeed. "Building a house," he answered confidently. "Building a house. Good answer," Steve announced as the board revealed that it was the number 2 response. The Gonzalez family erupted in celebration, their first real moment of joy and unity since stepping onto the stage. The momentum continued through the next several questions. Carmen nailed an answer about things people save money for: the Kia, your children's future, and Maria correctly guessed that forgiveness would be on the board for things that are hard to give. With each success, the family's confidence grew, and something that had been dormant in Diego began to reawaken. But it was during the 4th round that everything changed. The category was name something a father dreams of doing with his daughter, and the question fell to Maria. Steve walked over to the family podium, his microphone ready, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. "All right, Maria, he said with his usual enthusiasm. Name something a father dreams of doing with his daughter. Maria looked directly at her father, who was gripping the arms of his wheelchair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. She thought about all the conversations they'd had about the future, all the promises that had been made before the accident, all the dreams that seemed impossible now, but had once felt as certain as sunrise. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the studio with the kind of honesty that cuts through all pretense and performance. Running, she said simply, running together. The answer hit the studio like a physical force. Steve Harvey, a man who had heard thousands of answers over his years of hosting, stopped moving entirely. The studio audience fell silent as they processed not just the word, but the way Maria had said it, the way she had looked at her father, the weight of love and longing that had filled that single word. Steve looked from Maria to Diego and suddenly understood everything, and the careful way Diego held himself, the protective way Carmen hovered near his chair, the maturity beyond her years that Maria carried, the undercurrent of loss and love that he had sensed during the introductions. This wasn't just a family competing on a game show. This was a daughter holding on to a dream that seemed impossible, and a father who had forgotten that some promises transcend physical limitations. The board revealed that running wasn't among the survey responses, but in that moment, nobody cared about points or prizes. Steve Harvey, who had built a career on quick wit and perfect timing, found himself completely speechless as he watched a 14-year-old girl refuse to give up on a promise her father had made in a different lifetime. Diego was crying now, tears streaming down his face, as he looked at his daughter with a mixture of love, regret, and realization. Maria reached over and took his hand, squeezing it with the strength that comes from never giving up on the people you love most. Steve set his microphone down on the podium and walked directly to the Gonzalez family. The cameras kept rolling, but this was no longer television. This was humanity at its most raw and beautiful. "Diego," Steve said, his voice gentle but strong. "Can I ask you something?" Diego nodded, unable to speak through his tears. "Did you promise this beautiful girl that you would run with her someday?" Another nod, this one accompanied by a sound that was part sob, part laugh. Steve looked around the studio, at the audience that was watching with tears in their eyes, at the Johnson family, who had forgotten entirely about competing, at the camera operators, who were struggling to maintain their professional composure. "You know what?" Steve said, his voice carrying across the studio with absolute authority. "We're going to do something different today." He turned to Maria, whose tears were now flowing freely, but whose posture remained strong and determined. "Maria, honey, I want you to know something. Your dad kept his promise. He taught you how to run toward your dreams, how to never give up, how to love someone so much that you refuse to let them forget who they are. That's not something you do with your legs, sweetheart. That's something you do with your heart." Steve began removing his suit jacket, the same burgundy jacket that had become part of his television persona. As he draped it around Maria's shoulders, he continued speaking. "But if you want to run a 5K with your dad, if that's your dream, then that's what we're going to make happen, because some promises are bigger than the obstacles that try to stop them." He turned to Diego, whose tears had transformed from despair to something that looked remarkably like hope. "Diego, I want you to listen to me carefully. This girl right here, she doesn't see a man who can't walk. She sees her hero, her teacher, her dad, and she's been training to run that race with you because she knows that being together is what makes the running matter." Steve gestured to the studio around them, to the lights and cameras, and all the manufactured energy that created the world of television. "None of this matters as much as that promise you made to your daughter. None of the points or prizes or games matter as much as showing her that love finds a way." What happened next would be talked about for years afterward, replayed millions of times on social media, and remembered as one of the most powerful moments in television history. Steve Harvey, America's favorite game show host, began to push Diego's wheelchair around the Family Feud set. "Come on, Maria," he called out. "Let's run with your dad." Maria immediately began jogging alongside her father's wheelchair, her face transformed by pure joy as Steve pushed Diego around the stage. The studio erupted in applause, but not the typical game show cheering. This was the sound of people recognizing something sacred, something real in a world that often felt manufactured and distant. The Johnson family joined them, running alongside the wheelchair in a spontaneous display of human connection that transcended competition. Carmen was crying and laughing simultaneously as she watched her husband's face transform, from resigned sadness to genuine happiness for the first time in 18 months. Around and around the stage they went, Steve pushing Diego's wheelchair while Maria ran alongside, her hand on her father's arm, both of them laughing and crying as they completed lap after lap. The audience was on its feet, camera operators were wiping tears from their eyes, and even the typically composed production staff were openly emotional as they witnessed something that would change everyone involved. When they finally stopped, Steve knelt down beside Diego's wheelchair, his own eyes bright with tears. "You know what this means, don't you?" Steve asked quietly. Diego shook his head, still overwhelmed by what had just happened. "It means you've been running with her all along. Every day you get up, every day you support her dreams, every day you show her how to be strong. That's running, Diego. That's how a father runs with his daughter." Steve stood up and addressed the entire studio, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we learned something important. We learned that running isn't about how fast your legs can carry you. It's about how far your love can go. And this family right here, they've been running marathons of love every single day since they learned what it means to face the impossible together." The episode aired 6 weeks later and became the most watched Family Feud episode in the show's 50-year history. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about disability, dreams, and the power of family love to overcome any obstacle. The $20,000 the Gonzalez family won that day helped cover Diego's medical expenses and allowed Carmen to reduce her work schedule. But the real prize was something money couldn't buy: Diego's rediscovered understanding that his value as a father and husband had never been measured by his physical abilities. 3 months after the episode aired, Diego began training with Maria for the San Antonio Riverwalk 5K, not running in the traditional sense, but participating in the race category for wheelchair athletes, with Maria running alongside him as his partner and supporter. Their goal wasn't speed or competition, it was simply crossing the finish line together, keeping a promise that had seemed broken but proved to be unbreakable. Steve Harvey, who had made thousands of people laugh during his career, learned something profound that day about the difference between entertainment and impact. In interviews afterward, he said, "That family taught me that sometimes the most important moments in television happen when you stop worrying about the show and start caring about the people." The jacket Steve gave Maria still hangs in her room, a reminder of the day when a dream that seemed impossible proved to be simply waiting for the right moment to become reality. Diego framed the episode's air date, along with their 5K completion certificates, proof that some promises are stronger than any accident, any limitation, any obstacle life can create. Because sometimes running together isn't about speed or distance or physical ability. Sometimes it's about refusing to give up on each other, about finding new ways to keep old promises, and about understanding that the most important races are won, not by the fastest legs, but by the strongest hearts. The Gonzalez family ran their 5K together. 8 months later, Diego in his racing wheelchair with Maria beside him, both of them wearing Steve Harvey's burgundy tie colors, in honor of the man who reminded them that dreams don't die, they just find new ways to come true.